The lights in the congressional hearing room burned white and hot, washing over the polished oak tables and the rows of cameras aimed at the witness stand. Jerome Powell adjusted his tie once more, the faintest tremor betraying the calm he had worn through 2 monotonous hours of predictable questioning. Each senator and representative had taken turns praising or politely probing the Federal Reserve's actions. It had all followed the usual script: technical answers, safe platitudes, nothing to make the markets stir. Then Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's name was called. The freshman Democrat from Texas leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the desk, her gaze fixed on Powell as if locking onto a target. The buzz of whispered side talk and phone typing faded until the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. "Mr. Powell," she began, her tone even but edged with intent. "I've been listening to 2 hours of people circling the same question without touching it, so I'll ask it directly. About the $6 trillion 0 cents decision your Federal Reserve made. The one no one here seems brave enough to mention." The sentence landed like a dropped weight. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Aides looked up. The chairman of the committee blinked, unsure whether to intervene. Powell shifted slightly. "Congresswoman, if you're referring to our emergency asset purchases—" "I'm referring," she interrupted, "to a decision that reshaped every American household's cost of living. And I have the documents to prove it." From the stack beside her she drew a folder thick with papers, their margins fluorescent with highlighter. She had spent nights studying them, tracing footnotes, comparing statements and internal data sets until every contradiction glowed under her pen. Powell didn't know it yet, but the protective shell of institutional language he had relied on for years was about to crack. The Congresswoman's voice carried through the microphones with calm precision. "Mr. Powell, before politics I was a civil rights attorney. I learned that truth hides in paperwork, and accountability starts when the paperwork sees daylight. So today, we're going to let in some light." Powell inhaled slowly, clasping his hands on the table. "Congresswoman, I'll answer any question within the limits of confidentiality." She smiled faintly. "Good. Because I obtained this first document legally through a Freedom of Information request. It's an internal Fed memo dated March 2021. She handed it to a clerk, who delivered it to the witness. The pages rustled audibly in the silence. "That memo," she continued, "warns that maintaining asset purchases at the existing pace would likely create inflation beyond your 2% target for a sustained period. Yet you continued those purchases for another year. Can you explain why?" Powell cleared his throat. "At that time we judged the greater risk to be under-supporting the recovery. Economic conditions were... So you knew the risk of inflation and proceeded anyway." He hesitated. "We were balancing multiple objectives. Price stability and maximum employment both." "Let's stay on the record," Crockett said, tapping her tablet. A chart appeared on the large screen behind her. The Fed's balance sheet rocketing upward to nearly $9 trillion. "That's the result of your intervention. Unprecedented in American history. You called it decisive action. Your own economists called it dangerous." A murmur spread through the room. Powell tried to retain composure. "Congresswoman, monetary policy always involves uncertainty." She raised a hand. "Then let's remove uncertainty. Here's another document. Your meeting transcript with major bank CEOs, April 2021. You said, quote, "Inflation concerns are transitory and will normalize within quarters, not years." Did you believe that statement when you made it? Powell stared at the screen where his own words appeared in bold. At that time, the data supported a transitory outlook. Yet, she said evenly, a month earlier, the San Francisco Fed had already warned that supply chain disruptions plus excess liquidity would produce structural inflation not easily reversed. You received that report before you spoke to those CEOs. True or false? The silence stretched. "True," Powell said finally, his voice lower. The committee chair shifted in his seat, uncertain how to handle what was quickly turning from testimony into cross-examination. Crockett pressed on. "So your economists warned you. You disregarded them. Americans paid the price. Groceries up 25%, rent through the roof, and wages stagnant. Tell me, Mr. Powell, Was that the price of doing too much, or the cost of not listening? Across the chamber, reporters typed furiously, their screens reflecting Powell's expression, a blend of irritation and dawning concern. He spoke carefully. Policy must consider the entire economy. With limited foresight, we made the best decision possible. The best decision possible, Crockett repeated, flipping to another section of her binder. Let's look at 5 consecutive meetings of your Federal Open Market Committee. Each one included internal presentations warning that continued asset purchases inflated asset prices without improving employment. Each time the committee voted to continue. I want to know why. Powell glanced toward his aides. None dared meet his eyes. Congresswoman, those minutes reflect robust debate. The final consensus was, consensus to ignore evidence, she cut in. Evidence that your own data contradicted your public statements. The chair announced, the gentlewoman has 2 minutes remaining. Crockett nodded once, unhurried. She held up a final set of papers. One more item, Mr. Powell. Your staff study on distributional effects, dated September 2021, concludes that 72% of the wealth created by your asset purchase program accrued to the top 5% of earners, while inflation, driven by the same policy, hurt the rest. Did you read that report? Powell's knuckles whitened on his pen. I was briefed on its findings. Then you knew, she said softly. You knew who benefited and who suffered. The clock ticked. The chair cleared his throat again, but no one looked at him. All eyes were on the Fed chair. Powell straightened his papers, buying seconds. The Federal Reserve doesn't target wealth distribution. Our mandate is macroeconomic stability. And yet your policies destabilized the very households that make up that macroeconomy, Crockett replied. So I'll ask you plainly, did the Federal Reserve make a $6 trillion 0 cents mistake? Her voice was calm, but the words hit like hammer strikes. Powell froze. The chairman of the committee leaned toward his microphone. The witness may respond. Powell exhaled slowly. Congresswoman Crockett, monetary decisions involve trade-offs. That's not an answer, she said. Yes or no? Was it a mistake? The room waited. Cameras clicked. Even the hallway outside seemed to still. Powell stared down at the memo she had first handed him. The warning his staff had written. The one he had brushed aside. When he spoke again, his voice lacked its earlier confidence. With hindsight, he said, the scale of our intervention exceeded what was necessary. The phrase hung in the air. A murmur swept the chamber, spreading outward like a shockwave. Crockett leaned closer to the microphone. So you acknowledge the Federal Reserve acted excessively? Powell's eyes flickered. Yes, relative to what was required. For a moment, time froze. The most powerful banker in America had just confessed an error measured in trillions. The journalists in the gallery moved at once, thumbs flying over phones, messages shooting to editors. Powell admits excessive intervention. Crockett's expression didn't change. And that excess primarily benefited whom, Mr. Powell? Our policies were designed to support the economy as a whole, he answered, voice tightening. She pointed to the chart on screen. Your own report says 72% of gains went to the top 5%. That's not the economy as a whole. That's a transfer upward. Did the Federal Reserve intend to enrich the already wealthy while burdening ordinary families? No, he said, almost whispering. But it did. Powell's silence was answer enough. Across the chamber, the chair tried again to restore order. The gentlewoman's time has expired. Crockett closed her binder but didn't look away from Powell. History will remember this, Mr. Powell, because millions of Americans are still paying for that excess. When the gavel struck to announce recess, the spell broke. Reporters lunged for the aisles. Lawmakers whispered urgently to aides. Powell remained seated, motionless, the microphone still hot before him. On every monitor in the press room, the clip replayed. His concession, her question, the moment the facade cracked. 15 minutes later, the headlines were already forming. When the committee reconvened after recess, the energy inside the chamber had shifted entirely. Gone was the procedural rhythm that had carried the morning. In its place, A tense awareness filled every corner of the room that something historic had just occurred. The Federal Reserve Chairman, a man known for his precision and restraint, had admitted before cameras in Congress that the nation's most powerful financial institution had gone too far. Jerome Powell returned to the witness table visibly changed. The perfect composure that had long defined him was gone. His aides whispered in hushed tones, sliding fresh briefing notes across the desk. But he barely glanced at them. Cameras tracked his every motion, each blink, each twitch of his hand. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her binder now closed, her posture steady. She didn't need to speak again. Her questions had already rewritten the day's headlines. Around her, members from both parties looked at her with a mix of admiration and apprehension, the kind reserved for someone who had crossed an invisible line and emerged stronger for it. The chair banged his gavel, calling the hearing back to order. The committee will resume its questioning. A senior Republican congressman leaned forward first. His voice carried the practiced tone of someone trying to appear neutral while sensing blood in the water. Chairman Powell, if your economists warned of inflationary pressures and you proceeded regardless, how are we to trust future Federal Reserve assurances? Powell's response came haltingly. Congressman, our intent was to stabilize markets in an unprecedented crisis. We did not ignore the warnings. We weighed them against other indicators. And yet, the congressman pressed, those warnings were correct. Inflation spiked, and Americans paid the price. Was it ignorance or arrogance that led to your decision? Powell shifted uncomfortably. It was caution, Congressman. Perhaps misplaced, but caution nonetheless. The exchange emboldened others. A Democrat followed next. Mr. Chairman, millions of Americans are asking today how the most powerful economic institution in the world could make a mistake of this magnitude. You told us inflation would be transitory. You told us your models were sound. Are we to believe the Federal Reserve no longer understands the economy it manages? Powell inhaled sharply. Our models? Your models failed, the representative cut in. Your own documents said so. You continued anyway. That's not just a mistake. That's negligence. The hearing devolved into a chorus of overlapping questions. Powell's attempts to respond dissolved beneath the sound of clicking cameras and raised voices. The chairman's gavel struck repeatedly for order. Outside the Capitol, the storm had already reached Wall Street. On trading floors from New York to Chicago, television monitors replayed the moment of admission again and again. The Dow dropped 400 points within the hour, then another 100. Bond yields spiked. The dollar wavered. At the White House, economic advisors scrambled to draft a statement. We cannot appear blindsided, the president's chief of staff warned. We emphasize stability and accountability. We thank the chairman for his service, but we begin transition planning tonight. By early evening, the story had eclipsed every other headline. Fed chair admits $6 trillion error blared across cable banners. Financial networks interrupted regular programming for continuous analysis. Economists debated whether Powell's acknowledgement had done more damage than the policy itself. In the hall outside the hearing room, Jasmine Crockett faced a sea of microphones. The air was thick with shouted questions. Congresswoman, are you calling for Chairman Powell's resignation? How long have you been investigating the Fed? Do you believe this mistake was intentional? Crockett lifted her hands to quiet the noise. Today isn't about personalities or resignations, she said steadily. It's about accountability. For 3 years, working Americans have been told inflation was inevitable, that the system just happened to hurt them. What we learned today is that the Federal Reserve ignored clear warnings from its own economists. That's not inevitability. That's failure. Her calm, deliberate tone cut through the chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously, aware that they were witnessing the rise of a new political force. That night, the hearing dominated every network. Clips of Powell's trembling concession ran side by side with Crockett's unwavering composure. Financial commentators spoke in stunned disbelief. I've covered the Federal Reserve for 30 years, said a veteran CNBC anchor. I've never seen anything like this. A sitting Fed chair openly admitting that policy decisions worsened inequality and fueled inflation. In living rooms across America, viewers who had never paid attention to monetary policy watched with fascination. Some felt vindicated, others furious. On social media, the hashtag Crockett exposes Fed trended worldwide. Markets reeled for days. The Dow slid over 1,000 points. Bitcoin surged as investors fled to alternative assets. Central banks around the globe issued reassurances to calm contagion fears. The president convened an emergency meeting with Treasury and Fed officials, his voice tense. "If Powell can't stabilize confidence, we replace him," he said flatly. Behind the scenes, Powell's staff prepared damage control statements. Every word was weighed by lawyers and communications experts. But the admission couldn't be erased. Trust, once fractured, doesn't easily mend. 2 weeks later, under mounting pressure, Powell submitted his resignation. His letter cited communication challenges and the need for renewed leadership, but avoided repeating the phrase that had destroyed his tenure: a $6 trillion mistake. The markets bounced slightly on the news, as though relieved to see the page turned. Crockett read the resignation letter in her office, the late afternoon sun spilling across her desk. Around her, staffers worked in near silence. "He did the right thing," one aide said softly. Crockett nodded. The right thing came too late for millions of families. But it's a start. Within weeks, the House Financial Services Committee formed a special subcommittee to investigate the Fed's decision-making during the pandemic years. Crockett was named vice chair. Her appointment sent tremors through Washington's financial circles. Lobbyists who once ignored her now whispered her name in hallways. During the first subcommittee hearing, she delivered a statement that echoed far beyond Capitol Hill. "This investigation isn't about one chairman. It's about a system that has operated without true accountability. The Federal Reserve's decisions affect every grocery bill, every mortgage payment, every small business loan. Those decisions must face sunlight, not secrecy." The room erupted in applause, an unusual breach of protocol. In New York, financial journalists who had long parroted official Fed language began writing differently. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page analysis. The Crockett Doctrine, Accountability in Monetary Policy. Universities added new modules to their economic syllabi. Professors debated the implications of what students had already dubbed the Crockett hearing. In policy circles, her name became shorthand for a new kind of oversight: fierce, data-driven, and unwilling to defer to jargon. But Crockett wasn't interested in celebrity. She was working on something bigger: the Federal Reserve Accountability Act. The bill, co-sponsored with colleagues across the aisle, would require the central bank to publish distributional analyses of all major policies, include labor representatives on advisory boards, and impose stricter ethics rules on senior officials. When asked why she was pushing so hard, she simply said, "Because economic policy should serve people, not statistics." 3 months after the hearing, a new Fed chair was sworn in, a respected economist known for her commitment to full employment and transparency. In her first speech, she acknowledged Crockett's role directly. Congresswoman Crockett reminded us that independence does not mean immunity. The Fed serves the public, and the public deserves honesty. Internationally, the impact rippled outward. The Bank of England faced parliamentary questioning over its own bond purchases. The European Central Bank launched a review of its pandemic-era policies. Even the International Monetary Fund released a statement urging greater transparency among global central banks. In Washington, Crockett became a fixture on financial news programs, not for grandstanding, but for her clarity. She spoke plainly about inflation, wages, and accountability. "People aren't asking for miracles," she told one interviewer. "They're asking for truth and fairness." 6 months after the hearing, inflation had begun to ease. Markets stabilized. Mortgage rates slowly declined. For the first time in years, public trust in financial institutions showed signs of recovery. At a community college auditorium in Dallas, Crockett addressed a packed crowd. Workers, students, retirees, the people most affected by the policies she had challenged, filled every seat. "When I asked that question," she said, "it wasn't to embarrass anyone. It was to demand honesty for those who never get to ask questions in these rooms. The single mother juggling 2 jobs. The small business owner watching costs rise faster than profits. The retired teacher choosing between medicine and groceries. They deserved an answer. The audience rose in applause that seemed to go on forever. Cameras captured the moment. But for once, Crockett didn't notice. She was smiling. Not the smile of victory, but of vindication. On her office wall back in Washington hung a framed headline from the Dallas Morning News. Texas Congresswoman changes the Fed forever. Years from now, economists would still debate whether the $6 trillion intervention was truly a mistake or a misunderstood necessity. But what no one disputed was that one Congresswoman, with a binder full of evidence and a determination sharper than fear, had forced the most powerful financial figure in America to confront the truth. And from that truth came something rare in politics: real change.